Here in front of me is the Lumix G9 Mark II. I want to give you my perspective on this camera after shooting with it for a month as somebody who makes their living filming on a GH6. And we're going to do this rapid fire because I was supposed to have sent this back to B&H, the folks who loaned me this camera to try out for the last 30 days, 2 days ago. So let's get into it. Before we get into my pros, cons, and thoughts on the G9 II, I do want to say where I'm coming at this from. And that is the perspective of somebody who shoots way more video than I do photographs. Now I can already hear some keyboard warriors heading to the comments section to click-clack on their mechanical keyboards and let me know, well, actually, the G9 II is primarily a photo camera, so you're coming at this from the wrong perspective. Simply put, and you could probably call this the TLDR of this entire video, in many ways I feel that the G9 II is the best hybrid shooter for Micro Four Thirds currently on the market, and in some ways its video capability is superior to that of the GH6. But before we get to those pros, let's talk about the cons of this thing. Let's start with the flippy outy screen. It's lovely, we have it. It's great for vlogging, filming yourself in front of the camera, and getting different angles while filming. But I miss the tilt screen on the GH6. I didn't realize how much I used it until I didn't have it on the G9 II, and I wanted it. Being able to get a low angle and just tilt the screen versus having to flip it all the way out is something I was missing. It also makes for easier access to the ports, such as the HDMI and headphone jack. When you have the screen flipped out, you can tilt it away and gain more room. A huge thing that I've really been missing on this camera is a tally lamp. Right now, the GH6 with its screen facing forward as I'm filming myself has two indications that I am recording very apparently. There's a red tally lamp on the front of the camera glowing in my face, and a red border around the screen that is also indicating you are recording. The G9 Mark II has neither of those things going for it. The only way I can tell I'm recording is I can see the timer on the screen ticking upward, and a little red indicator over the memory card telling me that it's recording to the memory card at that time. I feel like a simple firmware update could add the red border around the screen and it would go a long way. I had a friend over recently helping me film a section of a video and shoot some thumbnail photos, and he multiple times thought he was recording when he wasn't because he didn't know what to look for. I've heard a few reviewers complain about the mode dial not being locking on the G9 Mark II, but I personally have not found that I'm accidentally switching that at all. What I am accidentally bumping is the front control wheel on this thing. This is the wheel that adjusts your aperture by default or your white balance, ISO, or exposure compensation when you hit those corresponding buttons. Where it's placed at the forefront of the grip and being fully exposed on the top, I find I am constantly accidentally bumping it. The GH6, it is set back a little further on the top of the grip and is not fully exposed, so it's a lot more intentional when you hit it versus accidental on the G9 II. The next thing I don't love is the choice of media on this camera, namely UHS-2 SD cards. The GH6 uses the CF Express Type B cards, which are significantly faster. Yes, they are not cheap, but neither are these SD cards. And actually, I just checked, and right now on B&H, these two 128GB cards are the exact same price. And I actually paid less for the CF Express card on Black Friday, about $15 less. The G9 can record to an external SSD, as can the GH6, and if you want to record ProRes with this, you have to use the external SSD. But I actually ran into some problems with using that. I kept having it tell me that this SSD, a Samsung T5 drive, was too slow and it would stop recording. But I've used this exact same drive on a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, recording RAW to it without any dropped frames, no problem. All of this is avoided on the GH6 because the CF Express cards are faster than this external SSD, and I can internally record ProRes to these on that camera. We have 3 cons left before we get to the pros, so let's get done 2 of them pretty quickly. I wish this thing had shutter angle. It only has shutter speed adjustment, which isn't going to be as precise for the frame rates that I pick to film in. I just wish it had shutter angle, set it to 180, and I could call it done. And the last con on this thing is the autofocus. Yeah, it's great, but it's also not perfect. I've been using this thing almost exclusively in autofocus because that's what I heavily wanted to test here, and the thing that I'm missing the most from my GH6, because I cannot rely on that thing. But I keep finding that when I pull my clips in, I'm not getting critical focus on my eye or my face. Now, in fairness, there were quite a few things that I decided to film recently with a mist filter on, and that may be affecting things, but it shouldn't affect this much, I think. What I keep noticing is it'll be focused on my background, my backdrop behind me, and not my eye. But when I'm filming, I'm seeing the autofocus rectangle, the box, on my face like it's finding my face. Not that it's focusing on some random eyes on these figures in my backdrop. The camera seems to be indicating to me that it sees me and it should be focusing on me, but it's not. But this is also where I immediately want to pivot and start going into the pros, because while the autofocus isn't perfect, it's the best I've ever seen on a Lumix camera. On my GH6, I am not exaggerating, 98% of the time I am manually focusing this camera. I have it on autofocus right now just to see what it's gonna do, but normally I would set my focus and that's it, which limits the kind of shots that I can do. And while the autofocus on the G9II is not perfect, it is light years better than the GH6. A shot like this, where the camera is sliding rapidly toward me on a slider, is something I would never consider doing with the GH6. This may not be perfect, I'm betting it's not hitting my eye through this, but I guarantee you it's better than the GH6 can do, so let's see. Same exact shot, same lens, same settings on ISO, f-stop, both at 1.8, and the exact same keyframes on the slider sliding toward me with eye tracking autofocus on the GH6, and I guarantee you it's better on the G9. And of course, after reviewing the footage, that's probably the best I've ever seen the GH6 do when I'm trying to highlight how bad the autofocus is that I just can't rely on it. So let's try something a little bit different, and let's do a little more challenging scenario of a walk and vlog type setup. I've got lights on around the studio. I have noticed, I think heavier contrast makes the G9II not do as good of a job. Here's my studio, me walking around, talking to you folks, trying to see if it's going to keep focus on me. Yeah, it got lost in the dark backdrop there. And now let's switch to the GH6. All right, now we are on the GH6. Eye tracking autofocus continuous is on. I also had both of these set to their native ISO while running this test, so let's see how they do wandering around the studio. I can see the box is on the GH6's screen with it on my eye. It sees me, it sees my studio, and back to the bench we go. Jean, the cat here, wants to be in the video, and back. Of course, when I'm trying to show how bad your autofocus is, you actually do a decent job for once. Seriously though, I've spent a bunch of time tuning in the settings on the autofocus on the GH6. I really haven't done that on the G9II. I still found, even in that test footage I just did, the GH6 pulses. It suffers from that just wobble back and forth in the autofocus that the G9II does not. I feel like I can rely on this camera where I can't with the GH6. Moving on to another pro of this camera, the in-body image stabilization. I didn't intend to highlight this with the walk and talk I just did, but it actually did highlight it. The GH6 was good, the G9II has only improved upon that. They both have in-body image stabilization and additional electronic stabilization, and both of those were on in this testing, but the G9II also has two levels of electronic stabilization, standard and high. High will crop in a little bit and provide better stabilization. But I wasn't using the high setting in the walk and talk footage. That was just the standard setting, and it was better than the GH6. I'm a pretty shaky person who moves around a lot and consumes a fair bit of caffeine, so any bit of stabilization I can get, I'm going to be happy to have. I was using the 9mm lens on both these cameras for that previous testing, and that doesn't have lens stabilization, so it was only in-body and electronic on it, and it just works really well and makes me look like a stabler person. The next pro is something I don't have a scientific means of testing at the moment, and it's only my anecdotal feeling about all of this, and that is that I think the overall color and dynamic range on the G9II is superior to that of the GH6. In case you can't tell, I like contrast and vibrant colors. It's an aesthetic that I've adopted for most of my content, and this camera seems to handle that better than the GH6 does. Now, I've been shooting on the GH6 for a year and a half, and using the same LUTs and coloring techniques on the G9II that I've used on the GH6, I find that I can push the image around a little more with better noise performance overall. Ruby and I were just setting up a Christmas tree in our living room, and I was filming the process for another video, and it's a not very well controlled lighting situation, and I used both cameras to just get different angles on what we were doing, and the image out of the G9II is just superior. Now granted, I was not using the same lenses or same settings between the two different cameras, they were at different angles, there's a lot of variables at play here, but just overall, I've been using the GH6 for a year and a half now, and I find that I'm having a better time working with the image out of the G9 Mark II overall. A pro that I almost forgot to mention is battery life. On the exact same batteries as the GH6, this thing is getting significantly better life. I didn't test exact run times that I'm getting out of these, but what I can say for sure, for the last month, I have been using the G9 Mark II on batteries. I keep one on the charger, throw one in the camera, and I haven't had a single battery flat out die on me in a shoot. I've always gotten to the point where I'm like, oh, I can change a battery, swap it out, and get back to work. The GH6, while I've been filming this video, has been on a constant rotation of 3 or 4 batteries, just constantly out of it, into the charger, out of it, into the charger. Most of the time in the studio, I use a AC wall adapter in the GH6, and that's how I run it all the time because the battery life is just not good. The G9, I wandered around London shooting photos and video, and I never changed a battery. I'm really liking the battery life on this. The last pro that I really want to highlight with the G9 is the photo image quality and the experience of working with these photos. I know I said I'm coming at this from the video perspective, but I also said that I think this thing is an excellent hybrid shooter, and it's something that I've been missing. The GH6, when I went to this and started shooting photos on it, coming from the GH5, I was disappointed in the photo quality. The detail level and all that is fine, but the dynamic range is not. On the GH6, I find myself almost always bracketing photos for exposure. So I'll have 5 photos that I stitch together into one HDR image to get the contrast and the highlights and the shadows that I really want out of the images. The G9 is saving me storage space and editing time because I can take a single photo and get the results that I want. It has undeniably better dynamic range in photos than the GH6 does. I'm not a professional photographer, I do videos, but I am in love with the photos that I'm getting out of the G9, at least compared to the GH6. Do not take my list of cons being longer than my list of pros as an indictment of this camera. It's not. I just wanted to be fully transparent and honest about what I found with this thing, so maybe hopefully you can be informed or Lumix might see it and make some improvements. This sensor and autofocus technology in the body of a GH6 would be my ideal camera right now, as somebody who's still pretty heavily invested in Micro Four Thirds. I want to thank the folks at B&H for loaning me this camera so I could test it out and make this video. There will be affiliate links in the description to everything I've discussed here. Those don't cost you anything more, but they do give me a little commission to support the work that I'm creating. So please consider using those. All right, folks, I think that's where we're going to wrap it up for this one. If it wasn't the very end of the business year and the holiday season, I might tell B&H I was keeping this thing. But as it stands, I have the heartbreaking realization I need to send it back. So thank you folks for watching. Thanks for checking this out. A little bit different from my usual content, but let me know if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. See ya, folks.